Hey you guys, Guy Stevens here. What if you want to make a FileMaker system and you want your ID numbers to restart every month like this? So you have a date in the first month, which is invoice number 1. In the first month it all stays 1, 2, 3, but then the next month comes along and then your invoice number restarts until the end of that month, and then it restarts again. It's actually pretty easy, so let's see if we can build this. Invoice. Let's make a table called invoice. I've got a brand new file which is completely empty, and let's enter some fields. I'm going to start with ID number, serial number. And the very important thing is that if you're going to have your invoice number restart every month, then you will have an invoice number 1 every month, which is absolutely not smart. But if you want that system anyway, then you do have to make sure that your invoices have an actual ID, which is a serial number, and then you can have a separate field for your invoice number, and then those can be not unique, but then that doesn't really matter. Let's add some other fields. Let's make a date field, and let's say that I'm going to, let's say the creation date is going to be auto-entered in there. Then I'm going to say type, and this is how I would always make an invoice. I don't know if your way is maybe different, but I'm going to say that my type is always by definition a quote. When people ask me for a price, I'll make them a quote, and that quote might then later on turn into an invoice, but it doesn't have to. It could also just say a quote that doesn't go anywhere. Now when this type becomes, this quote becomes an invoice, I need to make an invoice number, which can be a number, and then I have an invoice date, because when you make a quote for someone, that could happen right now, and then that could be turned into an invoice maybe weeks or months later, so we're gonna have to have a separate date for that. Okay, that's a good start. Let's just add one for fun. And there you go, a description, that's fine. For this exercise, we don't really need anything else. Okay, I've got an empty layout, so let's go to Edit Layout. Let's go to View, Field Picker if you have FileMaker 13. Otherwise, you're going to have to drag your fields using this one. Let's see, what have we got? I've got Invoice. Oops, and this one is not even based on an invoice. Let's go off. Actually, this was from the exercise I did before. Let's get rid of this one. Okay. I've got my layout and I've got my fields in there. If you don't have your fields, you just go to your field picker and you just drag your fields over in there. But that's done for now, so let's hit new record and let's see what happens. My serial number automatically enters the number 1, which is awesome. Then I've got my date, which is the date that I've created this quote. That's cool. This quote can also be an invoice, so we're going to have to fix that. And then I need to have an invoice number and an invoice date. Alright, let's go into Edit Layout and start fixing this stuff up a bit. I've got 2 dates here that can go and be turned into drop-down calendars to include an icon to show and hide calendar. That's cool. That way I can select a date. This type is going to be a drop-down list of invoice type. Looks like I created that one before already. Let's delete this one so you guys can see invoice type, how it's created. It's really simple. It's a quote to start with, and then it can become an invoice or even a credit note. Credit note is the same as an invoice. It also has an invoice number, but it's usually like a negative amount. Okay, if we do that, then let's see what we've got now. We can turn this quote into an invoice or a credit note. And the moment we turn this into an invoice, we of course have to come up with an invoice number. And now that's very simple, it's number 1. But what if we've got a whole bunch of them? Then what? If I manually enter this number, I'm going to make mistakes. So I don't want to do that. Okay, if we want our number to restart every month, then we're somehow going to have to figure out what our month is. If we choose an invoice date, then, well, this is the 3rd month of 2015. I have to somehow single these guys out, and that's very simple. I could go to File, Manage Database. I could say give me a calculation that I always call C_, and I'm going to say give me the year of the invoice date. This is going to be a calculation field right here. I'm going to create that one, and I'm going to say you can actually find it right here. If you type the Y in here, you can see year date, which will give me the year 2015 of the, in this case, I want it from the invoice date. This calculation is going to result into a number because it's going to give me 2015, which is good. And now what I would like to also have is the month of the invoice date. It's also going to be a calculation. That's cool. And if we type MON, then we get month, date, and month name. Month is just going to give us a number, 01 for January, 2 for February. Month name is actually going to give us the name. Now I just want to have the month number of the invoice date, like so, and that's going to result in a number. That's cool. There you go, and then we can hit OK, and then let's try and find out what these things do. Let's drag our little field thingy right here, our little field tool, and then let's add our C invoice year date, and then let's control drag this one down to create our C month invoice date on our layout right here, so that we can see what's going on here. Okay, if you go back into browse mode, then we will see if my invoice date is 15/3/2015, it's going to give me 2015 for the year and 3 for the invoice date. Now, if I go back to File, Manage Database, and well, actually, I could probably use both of them as a relationship. So if I now go into relationships right here, I control drag this one, or what I could also do is just click this one and click those two little plus signs in here. This creates a new table occurrence. Now this is not, it's very important to realize that this is not a new table. I do not have a new invoice table. In fact, if I go here, then I can see that my source table is invoice, and here my source table is also invoice. If I go to tables, I will see that I still have only one invoice, but I have two occurrences of this invoice. That means when I'm on a layout based on this invoice, I can see data from this table occurrence, and the data that I'm going to be seeing is going to depend on the relationship I make between these two. Now the relationship that I'm going to make this a bit bigger, is I'm going to relate the year to the year and the month to the month. So I've got two relationships. Now if I do that, let's say that I make a new record, or that I just give this invoice a number 1. If I add a new field, let's drag this one down here, and if I say now I want to see from my invoice number 2, I want to see the invoice number from table occurrence 2, then I'm seeing this number 1 from my other invoice. But if I make a new record here, turn this into an invoice, give it number 2, and now I'm still doing this manually, but I'm going to have this happen automatically in a second. Then what happens is, when I select an invoice date, I will again see a number from the other side. The only problem is I'm only seeing the first number and not this number 2. But if I add File, Manage Database, if I add to my field, now if I want to add this to this table is based on this one. So this one is actually table occurrence of this one. So any field I add here will be added here as well. So if I go to fields and I make a summary underscore max underscore invoice, then I make this a summary field, I can say create this one and give me the maximum of invoice number. Okay, if I do that, then I can turn this one into that max field, and then I'm going to say max invoice number. Then now I'm seeing the highest number of invoices from that year and that month. So if I look at my relationship here, I've got my year and my month of my invoice date, and that displays all those records here, and I always can see the max invoice number. If I go now to make a new record, and I say that that's an invoice number. Let's say it's number 1 of the next month. Let's say 1 month further. Then the max invoice number is going to be 1, because in this month I've only created 1 invoice with number 1. So the highest number in this month is number 1. That's what I'm getting here. If I now make a script that looks at this number and just simply adds 1, then I can automatically make the next invoice number for the next month. That's going to be a script, and the thing is, this script needs an action, but that's very simple. The action is basically here. When you have a quote and you turn it into an invoice, then I need to get an invoice date that needs to be today, and when I have my invoice date and I know which month and which year I'm in, I can then calculate the highest number in that month and that year. I can just see it right here, and then I can just add 1, and that will be my invoice number. So that's all. It sounds maybe a little bit complicated, but it's really, really, really simple once you have this set up like this. Okay, so there's one thing to pay attention to. When I turn my quote into an invoice and all of a sudden I realize, whoops, I made a mistake, I have to turn this into a quote again, then this one has to disappear. These two have to be emptied out, because all of a sudden it's not an invoice anymore. Now this requires a script that happens at this moment. So let's see if we can first build that script and then attach it to this field as a script trigger. I've got a script here. Let's delete that one and start from scratch. Let's say I would like to create invoice number. Okay, the first thing that we have to do is we have to check if this type is actually an invoice, because if it's a quote, then I don't want any of this stuff filled in. If it's an invoice, then I do. So let's start first with if type is equal to quote. And when you make scripts, you always have to kind of think ahead about all the possible things that could possibly happen. If the invoice type is quote, then I'm going to go and do a set field. Then I basically have to empty these two out, whether if there is something there or not. I'm going to say, give me my invoice number and make it empty. You can make it empty by using 2 quotation marks with nothing in between them. And I'm going to copy paste this one and say that my invoice date also needs to be made empty. And just to make sure that that is really safe, I'm going to say commit records perform without dialog. Okay, that's my first kind of possible situation that can happen. It's a quote, and then I don't want any of these things filled in. Let's copy and paste this one. Oops, I didn't get them all. Copy and paste. Now, what happens if my invoice type is an invoice or a credit note? Well, actually the exact same thing happens. So I can say if invoice type is invoice or invoice type is credit note. If that happens, then what I want is I can't set my invoice number first, because I don't know yet which month I'm in. I have to first determine the month. So I'm going to have to set my invoice date first. Set field invoice date, and the value is not going to be empty, but it's going to be get current date. If you don't know how that is written, you can go to the get functions here. You can search for it right here, and you could say get current date. Voila, very simple. It's going to get today's date and it's going to enter that in the invoice date. Now, when I've got my invoice date entered, then I can go and look up this maximum number from that related field, but I want to be sure that this is actually giving me the correct number. So what I'm going to do is, after I've set my date, I'm going to set one of those commit record request steps. So I'm going to copy this one. I'm going to paste it in here so that after I've set my date, that I really commit the value in that date field, so it's really saved, and then the value in my related table is definitely going to be correct. So then I'm going to set my invoice number, and what number am I going to get? Well, from my related table, the invoice 2, and I actually should have given this a more proper name, like invoice number or something like that. I can still rename that in a second. I'm going to get not the invoice number, but that max invoice number. And I'm not even just going to get that one. I'm going to say if this one is empty. So I'm going to make an if statement. So I'm going to say if because of course if we're in a new month and there are no invoices, then there is not going to be a max invoice number. There's just not going to be a value in here, and then this system just taking max invoice plus 1 is not going to work. So I'm going to have to say if is empty my max invoice, then that's simple. I'm going to have a new invoice and it's going to get number 1. If not, if this value is not empty, if it has a value, like for instance number 3, then I'm going to say give me that S max invoice plus 1. Okay, this function cannot be found. Let's see if is empty cannot have a space. I think that's probably going to solve my problem. Yes, okay. Is empty has got to be without a space. So what am I doing? If my invoice type is invoice or credit note, I'm going to set my invoice date. I'm going to really save that value. Then I'm going to get my invoice number from that related field, and I'm just going to add 1. And then I'm going to commit this record, and then I am done. This looks kind of good to me. Now let's try this out. Let's close and save. And now we're going to have to set this one to happen when I've changed the value in this field. So let's go into edit layout. Let's not this field, the type, of course. I'm going to set a script trigger, and then I'm going to choose the event for my script trigger. So when I enter this type field, that's on object enter, the script will be run after the selected object becomes the active object. Well, that's too soon because I haven't changed my value yet. So keystroke, no, I'm not even going to do a keystroke. I'm not going to be entering anything in there. On object modify, yeah, that could happen. As soon as I select a new value, my field is actually modified, so that could be a good one. Or in fact, I could get one of these as well. I'm just going to go, because it's a drop down, I'm just going to go with on object modify. I'm going to create invoice number. Okay, that's good. Let's try this out. Let's exit the layout. Let's create a let's create a quote first. All of these things are empty now. Let's create an invoice, and I automatically get invoice number 3. I'm in the 3rd month, so let's have a look around. What else did I have? I have invoice number 1 in the 3rd month, invoice number 2 in the 3rd month, and invoice number 3 in the 3rd month as well. That's good. Actually, I can't really try doing something in the next month because my invoice date is being set by my script. What I could do is I could just change all these invoice dates to an older. Let's try this out. Let's just make a new one. Let's say invoice. Well, it does kind of work, but I can't test this out now. I can't test what it's going to do in the next month until I maybe just cheat in my script a little bit. If I say set field invoice, instead of get current date, I could say give me, let's specify, let's just cheat for a second right here and say give me 01, not 04, 2015. Okay, so if we make a new invoice in the 4th month, so these are all in the 3rd month, then I should be getting, let's save this one, then I should be getting a new invoice number. It should then become number 1. So let's try this out. Let's make an invoice. Oops, I think I may have made a mistake here in that date. 14/03/2015. Yeah, I think what I did wrong was I didn't put any I didn't put any quotation marks around here. Let's do this one for 2015. That's probably going to work a little bit better. Let's see this one. Let's delete this record and let's make a new record and a new invoice. Yeah. That's better. So now my invoice date is in the 4th month. You could see it right here, month number 4, and the maximum invoice number in here is 1 because this is the first one. And then if I make a new one, and again 1 in that 4th month, it's just going to add up to number 2 and so forth. And every new month, I'm gonna start again from scratch. So that is good. Let's get rid of this one. Let's change this one again to get current date. There you go. That's kind of good. And now let's try something out. If we turn this back into a quote, well, then these are emptied again, and that's kind of good. The only thing to pay attention to is if you make an invoice, and now this is, let's see, invoice number 1. Oh yes, this is my get current date again, so I'm back into my month number 3. And I had 4, now I'm up to 5. If I make, let's say, a new invoice, and this invoice is number 6, and I go back to my invoice number 5 and I delete this invoice, then my invoice number 6 is still going to be my highest number. So the moment that I now create a new invoice, that invoice will get the number 7. So I do have a gap now. I've got invoice number, for this month I've got 4. I've got, well, I'm going to delete this one for a second because it's in another month. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, and so I've got a gap now. If I want to delete an invoice and I want my numbers to stay clean without a gap, then I'm going to have to change the invoice numbers right here. 6 is going to have to become 5, 7 is going to have to become 6, and from then on, if I make a new record and it's an invoice, then it will start count. It will kind of continue from where I left off. So you can always kind of alter your invoice numbers if you want, if you have a gap that you need to close, and then from then on, you will continue again correctly, and the next month you will start again from 0. Now, it's possible that you don't want to use this system where you have a quote first and then turn that into an invoice. You might want to have a very simple system. So let's see if we can maybe make that work as well. Let's try a second table. Let's call it Invoice Simple. And let's add some fields to that one. Let's say you just want to start with an ID number field, which I always kind of want. And then let's say that we're not going to have a type field, because let's say we're only making invoices, which I don't really believe is actually realistic, but it can be done. So let's say that I then want an invoice date, which is a date, and I want that to be entered automatically, because as soon as I create a record, it'll be an invoice. And then, of course, number, it's going to be a number. Okay, I'm going to extract again the C year, which is going to be a calculation, and I'm going to call it year from my invoice date. That's going to be a number, which is cool. Then I've got C month, which is going to give me the month of my invoice date as well. It's also going to be a number, so that's cool. And then I'm going to get my CS max invoice number, which I will be using from my other table occurrence. So maximum of the invoice number, which is cool, and this one is going to come from my other table occurrence. So I'm going to go in here, and to make my table occurrence stand out a bit more, I could give it a color. Then I'm going to either control drag or hit these 2 plus signs right here. And now this time I'm going to rename this one and say invoice number, so that I know exactly why this thing is here. It's here to give me my maximum invoice number for that year and for that month. So that's kind of cool. Let's go back to our fields right here. And now we can say that our invoice number needs to be, let's make it a calculated value. And let's say I need to get from my simple invoice number, I need to get this max ID, this max invoice number plus 1. But again, if there is no value in here, then I will get nothing. So I'm going to create an if statement and say if is empty this one, then I'm going to get 1 as a result. This is going to be invoice number 1. And if not, I'm just going to get S max invoice number plus 1. Okay, let's try this out. I think this is kind of good. Let's have a look if I've got a layout here. Let's make a new record. Okay, this is invoice number 1. That's kind of good. Let's edit layout. Let's double click this one, and let's say I want to display this one from the invoice number table occurrence. Okay, let's make a new record. This is looking very good. Another one. Okay, this is counting up nicely. Let's say, what if we turn all of these into last month's invoices? And then we create, so we've got 1, 2, 3 in the second month. Then we create a new one right now. And this restarts again at 1. So that's kind of cool. Now I've got 1, 2, 3 in the second month. And in the third month, I start again from 1 and 2. So this is a simpler system, but of course with this system you're kind of stuck. You don't have the ability to create a quote or a credit note, so it's a bit simpler, but this also works. So this is a second way of doing this. If you guys want to learn a lot more about FileMaker, you can go to my Udemy page, where I've got a couple of FileMaker courses online, and one of them is a complete FileMaker invoice database. It teaches you this invoice number trick that I just taught you, but it teaches you a hell of a lot more as well. It teaches you to build from scratch an entire completely FileMaker invoicing solution with products, invoices, inventory tracking, reporting, and all of that stuff. So if that interests you, you can follow the link that's in the description. Ciao.